The reported U.S. military strike in northwestern Nigeria on December 25, 2025, represents a significant and controversial shift in international relations, sparking a complex debate over sovereignty, humanitarian duty, and the framing of conflict. From an appraisal standpoint, proponents argue that the strike demonstrates a decisive commitment to protecting vulnerable populations where local governance has struggled to contain extremist violence. By targeting ISIS-linked groups in Sokoto state, the action can be viewed as a necessary use of force against radical Islamic terrorism that has caused years of instability. For those who feel the international community often remains silent during mass killings, this guns-a-blazing approach is seen as a moral fulfillment of the responsibility to protect, providing a swift military response to a long-standing security vacuum. However, from a critical perspective, the intervention raises alarming questions about national sovereignty and the oversimplification of complex conflicts. Critics argue that framing the violence strictly as a slaughter of Christians ignores the reality that thousands of Muslims have also fallen victim to the same extremist groups and banditry in the north. By labeling Nigeria a disgraced country and acting with what appeared to be unilateral pressure, the US risks inflaming religious tensions rather than quenching them. Furthermore, conducting such a strike on Christmas Day, while symbolic for the US domestic audience, can be perceived as an escalatory or crusader narrative that extremist groups use for recruitment, potentially worsening the very violence the strike sought to end. Sincere people of concerns may ask if it is more accurate to call this a matter of humanity rather than religion. There is strong evidence for this view. For instance, data from groups like ACLED shows that violence in Nigeria affects both Christians and Muslims. Security experts often argue that the root causes are economic and environmental, such as the farmer-herder conflict over shrinking land, rather than purely theological. When the US frames the issue solely as religious persecution, it may gain support from specific political bases, but it risks missing the humanity of the Muslim victims who suffer under the same terrorists. A truly humanity-first approach would address the protection of all citizens regardless of faith. Not bad to also address if it is accurate for the US to keep fighting on religious grounds. Well, in modern geopolitics, fighting on purely religious grounds is widely considered anachronistic and dangerous. Most modern conflicts that appear religious are actually struggles over political power, resources, or justice. So, the U.S. using religion as a primary battle cry often blinds the combatants to the underlying socio-economic solutions needed to bring lasting peace. It won't be completed not talking about the United Nations stance on this trend. UN stance remains anchored in international humanitarian law, IHL, and the Charter of the United Nations. The UN generally prohibits military intervention in a sovereign state unless it is for self-defense or authorized by the Security Council. Although it should be known that the US claimed coordination with Abuja on this attack, any unilateral action is typically viewed by the UN as a violation of territorial integrity. Also, the UN does not take sides in religious disputes. Its position is that member states must protect all persons from atrocity crimes including genocide, war crimes, and ethnic cleansing. Above all, the UN consistently condemns groups like ISIS and Boko Haram, but it emphasizes that counterterrorism must be conducted in a way that respects human rights and avoids collective punishment or religious profiling. The Christmas 2025 US airstrikes in Sokoto state represent a high-stakes convergence of military decisiveness and ideological friction, where the appraisal of a powerful and deadly strike against ISIS-linked militants, such as the Lakurawa group, is tempered by a sharp critique of its religious framing. While the intervention provides necessary kinetic support to an overstretched Nigerian military and addresses genuine humanitarian atrocities, President Trump's specific emphasis on stopping the slaughter of Christians risks oversimplifying a conflict that security analysts and the Nigerian government maintain targets both faiths indiscriminately through banditry and socio-economic displacement. Accurate policy would shift from a purely religious battle cry to a universal humanity-first defense, as the UN and international law emphasize that religious-based combat is fundamentally destabilizing and often obscures the root causes of violence, such as environmental collapse and state failure. Moving forward, the UN must provide objective oversight to prevent the Sahel from becoming a theater for apocalyptic moral dramas, while Nigeria must assert its own protective capacity to ensure that foreign guns-a-blazing interventions do not further inflame the very sectarian tensions they seek to extinguish.